Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you 7 most important endgame principles. If you follow them, you should be able to navigate most endgames. Now, there are probably hundreds of endgame principles that are important, but mentioning all of them would be, firstly, for you guys too hard to understand, and many of them occur very rarely and are not as important as the ones I'm going to show you. That being said, analyzing a lot of endgames is going to introduce you to a lot more principles, but the 7 I have here should be enough for anyone on beginner or intermediate level to navigate most endgames well. And some of these may be simple, but since there have been countless examples of grandmasters ignoring these principles, they apply to any level, and it never hurts to be reintroduced to them. Principle number 1. The king belongs in the center in the endgame. Now, there is one exception, and that's major piece endgames. If, let's say, you have rook and queen versus rook and queen, what's important is to have your king very safe, tucked behind your own pawns. So you could say that the opposite is true for major piece endgames. Use that as an additional principle. In major piece endgames, king safety comes first, then piece activity. The number of pawns don't matter. But in simple endgames, knight versus bishop, as is the case here, bishops against each other, rook and bishop versus rook and bishop could be tricky. That's the only tricky one. Also rook and knight, where your king could be unsafe, but any combination where there's one piece for each side, unless it's the queen, you want your king in the center. Now this is just a random position I set up, which is obviously winning for black. If you turn on the engine, this is plus 1,000,000, and the only reason for that is that black's king is in the center and white's king is far away. Now, I deliberately chose an example where there are pawns on both sides of the board, and as we are going to see in another one of the principles, usually that should favor the bishop, because the bishop is a long-range piece. It can both attack and defend at the same time. The knight is slow. It will take it time to reach the other side of the board. And also here, the knight is relatively well dominated by the bishop, at least on d5 and e6. But still, black is completely winning, and there are a few ways to win. You can defend the knight, you can move the knight, you can play g5, you can play king e3, you can play knight e2 check. It doesn't really matter what you do, but following the principle to put your king as close to the center as possible, well, this is relatively contradictory because the king is in the center, but let's say as close to your opponent's side of the board is even more favorable than in the center. We should play king e3, that's the cleanest move. And it doesn't matter what white does. Let's say bishop f7. We can go g5, saving the knight, saving the pawn and defending the knight. I don't know, let's say c4. And now we can slowly start targeting things with our knight. Our king completely dominates the white king. It's clear that white would have to go this way to reach the center. That's never going to happen. Therefore, black can do whatever they want, even something like a5, I don't know, a5, h5, knight d3, and now we just slowly pick up the weaknesses. For example, bishop d5, knight b2, targeting the pawn. Our next move could be king d4, just picking up the pawn, entering a winning endgame. Or, well, let's play it safe. Let's not move our king from the dominating square. That would allow king f4. Let's play knight d1. Let's say white just waits. Knight c3. White just waits. Say here. Knight a4 maybe. White waits. Knight b2. Now the pawn is targeted. This has been prevented. And eventually we can come in and scoop up the pawn. King d4 now should work, even if king f4 is illegal. King f2, we can just take, and it's over. Our king is still better than the white king. So this is absolutely the first principle you need to master, and I think this is a good example of a position where one king dominates the other to such an extent that the other side just resigns. Okay, and it's the simplest one. but there have been many examples on top-level play where it's been ignored. If you're like me and you think practicing against the engine is boring because it either crushes you or plays like an idiot, try playing against Noctie. Noctie is a human-like AI that's going to adapt to your strength, is going to play like a human, try to trick you like a human, and challenge you on your own level. The first thing you can do is, of course, assess your rating, and you can play a rating test against Noctie. Yeah, the only move is g4 and then queen f4 mate? Yeah. Good. Yes! 2557! Come on! It's going to tell you your strength, but there are many, many more features. The first thing is, when you play Noctie, you get instant feedback, and all of your moves will get sort of color-coded. Noctie will immediately tell you if you made a mistake. That way you can ask Noctie to see where you went wrong. You can play games in openings you're trying to learn. So you can import any repertoire you want and play Noctie in that specific opening. Just go to repertoires. I've imported the Hillbilly when I was doing the video on the Hillbilly, but you can obviously create any repertoire. Just paste the PGN, and if you, for example, play the London system, you can play the London system against Noctie. Flashcards are an excellent tool, and I've spoken to Samuel, the owner and inventor of Noctie. He's going to make them even better. Flashcards are basically the mistakes you made in your games. Noctie is going to make you pay attention to them, and in the future they're going to be grouped according to theme, so it's going to be even easier to navigate your mistakes. One of my favorite features, if not my favorite one, and the one I use the most, is themes. So you can play Noctie in any specific position you choose. So if you go to your themes, you can see that I've made quite a few. So let's say you want to play out this position. This is a position from Spassky's game where he triangulated perfectly. If you're trying to practice something, you can create a new theme. Just add an FEN or a PGN and play it out against Noctie. That way, if you have an endgame you would like to practice, you don't have to find an actual human to play against, nor will you have to play against a 2800 engine or against a 500 engine human. If you would like to check Noctie out, you can follow the link in the description, and if you would like to get a 64% discount, use the code HANGING pawns. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, Noctie, for sponsoring the video, and let's get back. Okay, principle number 2 and 2.5, opposition and spare tempi. This, you could say, is just as important. It becomes more important once you realize that your king belongs in the center, and it usually applies in king and pawn endgames, but every endgame can be reduced to a king and pawn endgame. Therefore, it's always important, and you have to think about it before you make your last exchanges. Okay, if black had initiated the rook exchange entering this position, well, that would have been a mistake because white is absolutely winning. The reason white is winning is because white can gain the opposition and white has a spare tempo to use first. Black also has a spare tempo, so if white makes a mistake, black is going to be winning. So, well, let's look at a bad move first. Let's say white plays king d4, okay? Well, black isn't going to be winning, black is going to be drawing, but let's say white plays king d4, gaining the opposition. So for those of you who don't know, the opposition is where the two kings are on the same file or on the same rank with an odd number of squares between them, and whosever turn it is at a disadvantage. So in this case, black's at a disadvantage. If they move their king, white will just enter the position on either side of the board and lose the game. But black has a saving move, a5, and now it's white's turn. And wherever white goes, let's say king e4, black can enter the position if they calculate the endgame correctly, but they can also just go king e6, and that's it. There's no progress to be made. So black needs to play a5 to regain the opposition. If this pawn was already on a5, black would be busted, black would be losing, because black would have to move their king away. So let's go back to the original position. What does white do to make their extra tempo useful? Well, where can we go so that if black plays a5, we can play king d4 and seize the opposition? Also, where can we go so that if black plays king c5 or king c6, we can start picking up these pawns? Well, the answer is simple. King e4. That's it. That's the end of the game. Now, the crucial thing is, firstly, if black moves away, we just move in and we are much quicker. An easy way to do this is just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 until promotion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but we're queening first. Have the first check, have the extra pawn. Black is busted. However, in this position, if black tries to be smart and plays a5, how does white win? It's very simple. There's only one winning move, gaining the opposition, king d4. The black king now has to move away. It doesn't matter where it goes. If it goes to e6, we enter the position via c5. And once again, let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 2 tempi is more than enough. White's winning. So gaining the opposition requires you to plan ahead, unless it's a very simple position. And as a general rule, if you have a spare tempo, now this is an extreme example because both sides can use the spare tempo if white goes wrong. If white goes wrong, black draws with the spare tempo. If white plays well, white wins because of the spare tempo. But don't waste your tempi. Don't make meaningless pawn moves, because in a king and pawn endgame, pawn moves are never meaningless. They are either very good or very bad. And if you use them when the time comes, you could win or draw. If you use them prematurely just to make a move, even if you cannot see that the tempo is going to be important, that's like, I don't know, it's just, it makes no sense. You're using your resources without needing to. Okay, third principle, and this is a very important one. Rooks belong behind passed pawns, not in front of them, not laterally on the same rank. They belong behind the passed pawn. We're going to have a look at three positions. So the position where the white rook is behind the pawn, the black rook is in front. The position where the white rook is in front of the pawn, the black rook is behind. And the position where the, excuse me, wrong rook. I wanted to put the white rook here. Where the rook defends laterally. Let's imagine that this is a white rook. So in the first example, white is completely winning. And it's very simple to see why. White is just going to push the pawn. As the pawn advances, black's rook is going to have its scope reduced. It won't be able to move. It's going to be stuck to a8. And if the black king tries to approach and win the pawn, that's fine. If black tries to win the pawn and eventually takes the pawn on a7, well, white will have moved up the board to g6, and then white can just pick up the pawn and enter a completely winning king and pawn endgame because the black king is on a7. So this is the simplest win in the world. White just pushes the pawn. It doesn't matter if black blockades or not. Nothing matters. If black blockades, we just enter the position. If black tries to hold us off, eventually black's going to run out of tempi and black's going to have to move something. So we either move towards the rook, chasing the rook away, reaching the position where the rook's on a7, or we move towards the pawns. So I don't know, let's say king b7, king b5. Now black either moves the rook or moves one of the pawns, let's say h5. We can just wait. we can literally wait. Okay, let's say g3. g6, and now I'm sure everything wins, but I would play king c5 if I had white here, because that's just winning. If the black king tries to follow us, it's too slow. We can just go king d4 or king d5. Too slow. Too slow. King e5, king e7. King f4, king f6. Yeah, now we can just put black in Zugzwang. We can go rook a4 or rook a3 or rook a2, it doesn't matter. And now either the king moves away and we enter g5, or the rook moves away and we play a6. And if black wishes to keep this position of the king, that's not going to be possible, because now either the rook moves or the king moves. If the rook moves, we go a7. Now either the rook moves and we queen, or the king moves and we enter the position, and that's it. So this was a slightly more complex way to win. I wanted to show you how a relatively decent player would try to defend, but it wouldn't work anyway. Now the rook is completely stuck. It can never move because we queen. And of course, if black has no tempi and we have infinite tempi with our rook, this king and pawn endgame is completely winning for white, especially because we can just do this, check the king and win. Now, same position, the rook's in front of the pawn, simply doesn't do anything. Why? Well, let's say we put our pawn all the way on a7. How do we make progress? There is a concept called safe squares. Let's actually make the position slightly more difficult for black. Let's play g5. So this endgame is a draw because, firstly, if white tries to approach and queen, as soon as the king reaches the b file, black starts checking the king away. And then if the king goes to the c file, we go back, preventing queening. If the king goes to the a file, we check it away again to the b file until it finally reaches the c file. If it then tries to move towards our rook, we can just go rook a6 and repeat the process. So marching the king to help doesn't work. The only way black can lose is if black leaves the safety of these two squares. That's not applicable if the pawn is still on g7, because black can always stay on g6 and h7. But let's say there is no pawn shelter along the 7th rank. Why would black be losing if it, let's say, came to g6? Well, now this would be check, and once the king moves, we would queen, and that would be it. Why would this be winning? Because now white can go rook h8, and once black takes the pawn, black goes rook h7, picks up the rook, and that's it. So that's the only way black can lose. If black just waits, of course black can never take the pawn on g2, that should be said, because check and queen, or just move the rook and queen, even simpler. So black just waits, king g7, king h7, king g7, the king has reached b7, we check it away. Once it goes to the c file, rook h. That's it. No progress. White waits, we wait. Stay on these two squares. And that's why when the attacker's rook is in front of the pawn, the position is a dead draw. Now, a flank pawn, a rook pawn, is an extreme example, but this applies to any pawn, any passed pawn. Even if you don't have an extra pawn, you want your rook behind the pawn. Because in rook endgames, it's usually about how close your pawn is to queening, not about you having an extra pawn. If you're 3 pawns down as white and you have a pawn on d7 with a rook on d1, you're gonna win. It doesn't matter that you're 3 pawns down unless your opponent is also queening. Now the final example is a lateral defense. Once again, imagine that the rooks are reversed. I'm sorry, I set it up wrong. This could go either way. White has winning chances, black has holding chances, but obviously it's very hard to move the pawn up the board without losing it. Once again, this is a white rook on b4, black rook on a8. If you played a5, black would just take the pawn. So you need the help of your king, and it's going to depend on where the kings are. And that's a very complex endgame, very, very complex, and there are probably 20 interesting positions you could study to see in which white can win. I just wanted to show it to you as a third option. It's not a part of this principle, but it's better than having your rook in front of the pawn. If your rook defends laterally, you have winning chances. Okay. Principle number 4. Distant passed pawn. I cannot highlight this enough. I have a student and we were analyzing one of his tournament games last week. And he had a choice between getting a central passed pawn and an outside passed pawn. It was a pawn on the b file or a pawn on the d file as white. He chose to have a pawn on the d file in a knight versus bishop endgame. Now, he had the bishop. Why would you choose to have a central pawn? It makes no sense, because your opponent's king is very likely very close to the central pawn. In this case, white has a pawn on the a file, black has a pawn on the e file. White's king is 2 squares away from the e pawn. It's within the square of the e pawn. So this is the square, this is the square. White's within the square. White can always catch that pawn. White can also win that pawn. On the other hand, the black king is outside of the square of the a pawn. The white knight is going to have a hard time preventing that pawn from reaching a7 or a6, and then the knight's going to be stuck defending. And once again, let's just put that on the board. So white starts a5, let's say knight c6, a6, I don't know, king e7, knight c3, we want to go knight b5, so king d8, knight b5, king c8, king f3, I don't know what black does, let's say g5, king e4, king b8, g3, and black resigns. That's it. The king is too close to the a pawn and too far away from all of these pawns. I don't know, h5. White to play and win. There are probably 100 winning moves, I don't know, but the easiest one is just a7. If the black king reaches the corner, that's going to be a disaster. So let's say they win the pawn, takes, and look at where the black king is. It's because the passed pawn was on the a file. If this pawn was on c4, black would have excellent drawing chances. In fact, the position would be a dead draw, because the king would be, well, maybe it wouldn't be a dead draw. Because if I take the pawn on e5 and you've taken the pawn on c8, I'm still winning. But okay, I chose an extreme example. In any case, if you have a choice in a simple endgame to have an outside passed pawn or a central passed pawn, an outside passed pawn is usually enough to win. Next up, a famous principle, well, that has been around for 200 years probably. Principle of two weaknesses, most famously shown in Chereshevsky's endgame strategy. It might be the first chapter, I'm not sure. So usually one advantage isn't enough to win. This is a game Alyekhin played. It's an example I use in my lessons with my students, so I just have this around. Alyekhin has an outside passed pawn. His rook defends laterally, so it's not ideal. If the rook was on b1, this would be, well, it wouldn't be winning because there are still knights on the board, knights and bishop. If we traded bishop for knight and had a rook on b1, we know that we would be winning. So applying all the principles we've seen so far. However, in this position, it's not that easy to win with just our pawn. If we blindly push the pawn, we lose the pawn. If we tried to defend the pawn, we lose the pawn. So we need to do something else. Principle number 1, king in the center, of course, applies, and it wouldn't be a bad move to play king f1. It might be the best move. The engine says the best move is b5. It works tactically, because if b5, knight b5, we just go rook b4, winning the knight, so the pawn is actually immune if it reaches b5. So you could conceivably play b5, you could play king f1, king e2, bring the king over here, that would be good. However, the principle of two weaknesses says that we need two small advantages to win in the endgame. We need to draw our opponent's attention to two different things. And I think the strongest player to study that principle from is Anatoly Karpov. He does that in the middle game as well. So Alyekhin didn't play the most precise move, but it's a fine move, g4. Now, the idea behind g4 may seem abstract and hard to understand. The idea is to create a pawn weakness on the king side. So black played king e7, b5, e5, and f4. Now f4 is a mistake, definitely, because black could have traded on f4, reaching a completely symmetrical position with his king closer to the center. And after ef4, Black could have gotten away with this. White's still much better, of course, but it would have been very hard to create a second weakness. Instead of f4, Alechin could have gone rook a7, and this is a completely crushing move because it pins the knight, threatens eventually to play d6 if the rook moves, sorry, b6. So king d6, and now h4, let's say h6, h5. Now the pawn is fixed, and we can eventually play g5. And once we play g5, we are going to create a weakness. So for example, g6, preventing that, hg, fg, now there's a weakness on a6, and we can switch our attention to that. Rook a1, king g2, rook h1, game over. For example, after rook a1, h5, we can even go rook d1, I think. King c5, and bishop e4 should be winning. Bishop e4, if rook takes... Wait a minute, rook takes, bishop takes, maybe it's not winning. Oh, excuse me, we have rook c1, rook c6, rook g6. Wait a minute, rook c1, the knight must be defended. I've turned on the engine now to make sure I don't blunder. King d6, rook c6, king d7, rook g6. It is winning because we have two threats. No, wait. No, this is a draw. Oh, sorry, rook c7, stupid. Why did king d7, rook g6? Yeah, rook g6, and now if they take here, yeah, bishop c6, everything's hanging tactically. This isn't really a good example. I went too far. I just wanted to illustrate that he could have created a second weakness instead of playing f4. However, he played f4, which isn't precise. His opponent should have traded, but he played f6. And after f6, now his strategy paid off. Fe, now there are two weaknesses. There's a passed pawn moving up the board. There's an isolated pawn on e5. And the white king can reach e4. In fact, there's no way for black to prevent that. So from here on, I would say that the win was relatively simple. Rook a2, preventing king d6, and if king d6, then rook d2, of course, followed by rook d7. So the pawn was on e5, he needed to prevent the king from moving to the center, preventing black from following principle number 1. Rook b6, blockading the pawn, good. That's another small principle, passed pawns need to be blockaded, doesn't just apply to the endgame. Rook b2, h6, king f2, the king marches up the board, king f3, king d6 is still out of the question because of rook d2, knight d5. Now you don't really want to trade here because the king would be too good, but it takes, rook is behind the pawn, so this might actually be the cleanest win. Yeah, I think I would have done this if I had white. This must be winning. I don't know what they do. I don't want to go e4, definitely not. So let's just wait. Rook b1, what does black do? Because I have infinite tempi, I'm just going to wait. If the king ever moves away to c5, let's say I just go king e4 and that's it. They take, my king is too close to the pawns. So not king c5. Say g6, I just wait. Say g5, I just wait. Now the rook has to move. Oh wait, maybe there's e4. Oh, maybe there's e4 now. Maybe there's e4. Okay, so let's go king e2, and now if they play e4, we go king d2. And if king c5, king c3, rook takes, winning. Okay, so I'm slightly afraid of e4, because if I go rook b1 here and they go e4, I go king e2, they go king c4, king d2, I cannot approach. Now I cannot approach the position. They also have rook d6. Oof. Okay, so that could have been the cleanest win, just exchanging the knight, following all the principles we know. But he played h4, which is fine, knight e7, bishop e4. Again, he could have traded. Again, he could have traded, but he created a third weakness. Now there are three weaknesses, and the white king can enter the position anywhere. He eventually entered the position on e4. and one like this. Okay. Now, if it was up to me, I would have traded that knight and won the rook endgame, but he won without any risk. Rook endgames can be drawn. You could make a mistake. You cannot make a mistake here. Okay, the next principle is relatively well known, but I've seen people my strength mess up endgames. Opposite colored bishops with an extra pawn are a draw 99% of the time. If you have two extra pawns, it depends on how far apart the pawns are and where the kings are. So even with two extra pawns, where let's say your pawns are on d4 and b4, and black's king is, I don't know, on c6, it's very likely that that's a draw. In fact, in 99% of the cases it is. With one extra pawn, it's just a dead draw, because your bishop cannot do anything. This is a position from one of my students' games. Now, I wouldn't say white's completely winning here, but white has a very, very good position, and white's playing for the win. Any move is fine. You can play b5, you can play king f1, get your king to the center. I would advise you to go king f1 here. The pawn on h2 is immune due to g3. But he played rook a8. And after rook a8, his opponent must trade rooks, and that's it. About an hour later, they agreed to a draw because there's no way to make progress. There's nothing you can do here. It's just a dead draw. The reason it's a dead draw is that you can never push past the dark squares. Black puts the king on b6 or even on b8, and that's it. You are never going to queen that pawn. You have nothing to evict the king from b8 with. There's just nothing you can do. I know that this is relatively simple, but that student of mine is 1400 FIDE. So, you know, people make mistakes. Okay, the final principle, which applies in many positions and many different endgames with other pieces on the board, is that in structures where there are pawns on one side of the board or clumped together, knights outperform bishops. So an example like this. And in endgames where there are pawns on both sides of the board, bishops outperform knights. So plan your trades accordingly. If you have a structure like this, and you have the option to trade off your knight for your opponent's bishop, or if there is a pair of rooks on the board, and you can enter this position by trading rooks, you probably have an advantage. Now, with the rooks on the board, you still have an advantage with the bishop over the knight, but it depends on many different factors. Neither position is winning. This should be a draw. This should also be a draw, although it's, in my experience, very difficult to draw this. But with precise play, in this case, white can cause many issues for black and make them blunder, and in this case, black can cause issues for white. Knights can attack both colors. It depends on how the pawns get fixed, whose king gets closer to the center first. So in this case, of course, the optimal move for both sides would be for white king f1, for black king e7. So as a general principle, this is easy to see once I show it to you. Most people would say, oh yeah, I'd rather have the bishop here. But knowing this in advance of your last trade and planning this out is very important and something not many weak players do. Okay, I hope you got something from my 7 endgame principles. Let me know what you think. I'm sorry for the few mistakes. And stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.